It's been a long week at work. Sunday morning, I'm finally getting a chance to do a podcast. So thank you guys for clicking on the video. Hey, I just got on YetiBars.net. I'm making my monthly order here for my soaps. And I'm noticing all these cool new things they have on their websites. T-shirts, children's books, combo packages, and of course all their soaps and salves that are wonderful. I'm making my first order today of the lemonade stand, which was, I think, created by one of the Yeti brothers' daughters. I'm really anxious to try that. I'm also going to get some of the Shroot bars, Desert Bar. I'm going to get the Yeti Glacier, and there was one more. Violets. I'm going to get the Yeti Violets for my wife. She likes that. You guys check out YetiBars.net. I know you will be happy with your purchase. They're also on Facebook. Just look up Yeti Bars on Facebook. You can order from there. The best place is YetiBars.net. I think you'll really love their product. Give them a try. Use the code DC10 at checkout and get a 10% discount. YetiBars.net. Go give them a whirl. But right now, let's jump into these stories. I hope you guys enjoy it. All right, here we go. Here's an email from Carrie. This is an Alabama story. This is pretty good. It was a weekend of my wife's Baby Steps 5K Memorial Run at Tannehill State Park in Alabama. She and a couple of our friends founded the run to raise money for the Amelia Center Division of Children's Hospital of Birmingham. The Amelia Center helps grieving parents who have lost children cope with the loss and learn how to go on with their lives. Abby and I, unfortunately, know firsthand how consuming and unforgettable such a loss can be. We lost our twin boys, Brady and Brody, to preterm labor at 5 months. They weren't able to survive the delivery. This is hard to type and even think about, even 13 years later. But God has blessed us with 3 handsome and fun-loving boys. Bryant is 8 years old. We call him Bub Bub. Barrett, who we call Bear Bear, is 3, and our 2-year-old, whose real name is Brandon, we call Bobby. In addition to our sons, my nephew Nick, or Nick, has lived with us as our own son all of his life. I know what you're thinking. Why Bobby? Well, we thought it was because Bear Bear, who was 1 when Bobby was born, was trying to say baby, when we realized he could say baby just fine. So we figured we just wanted his brother to be called Bobby, and we went with it. We always stay in an old-time cabin at Tannehill for 3 or 4 days of the week of the 5K run, and this year was no different. We love being in nature, and we especially love hiking. So naturally, after the run was over and Abby and the little ones were taking a nap, Nick, Bryant, and I grabbed our walking sticks and we hit the trails. We had previously asked the rangers and the other park employees which trail would be the longest and least occupied. We'd been coming here the same month every year for the past 11 years, so we'd already been down roughly 90% of the hiking trails. Everyone suggested the same trails we'd already walked except for the maintenance man. He said we should follow the creek that runs through most of the park, but to be careful because it connected to privately owned land that is nothing but acres and acres of woods. The no trespassing signs have all fallen over the years, but if we stayed with the creek, we would be okay. We followed the maintenance man's instructions and had been walking the creek bank for a little over 2 hours, stopping to examine every bug, rock, and stick the boys found interesting when we came to a fork in the trail. We stayed true to our course, but the creek trail soon ended. We weren't willing to call it a day yet, so we headed back to the fork and took the other trail to see where it went. It led us uphill away from the water, and we hiked another 45 minutes when it brought us back down to what must have been the wildest, deepest section of the creek. It was a peaceful, serene southern landscape that made me want to sit down on the bank and watch the clouds as the setting sun turned the sky to evening hues. We were relaxing while I was letting Bryant beat me at tic-tac-toe, because I'm a dad and that's what dads do. when Nick pointed out the fact that everything had gone silent. There were no bugs chirping or birds singing at all. Even the wind had gone silent, secretly reveling in Bryant's glee at each momentary lack of reason that would lead another victory for him. I glanced over at Nick and realized he was sitting there frozen in a shivering, frightened state. I jumped up and went over to him with Bryant holding on to my belt loop. As we approached, we all saw movement in the thick brush on the opposite side of the creek. And then it happened. To our surprise, a massive rock the size of 2 truck tires stacked together came flying out of that brush at an impossibly high arc and then splashed down in the creek, sending water up in the air like a geyser with ripples in every direction. I was stunned for a minute or so, but I managed to come around. And then I grabbed Bryant and literally had to shake Nick back to reality. "Nick, you take the lead," I said, laying out our exit strategy. "Bryant, stay in the middle and hold Nick's walking stick in one hand and mine in the other. I'll follow in the rear. That'll keep us joined together and still give us room for fast walking." I had barely finished my instructions when a rain of small rocks came flying across the creek, some hitting the water, but most hitting the bank at our feet. We didn't wait another minute. We took off heading towards the main trail and back to our cabin. Once we made it out of the woods and safely back to our cabin, we sat on the porch and pondered what had happened. Nick could not talk about what he saw that had frightened him into a near catatonic state. Bryant only saw the rocks being thrown. I don't know what to think, but I can assure you I didn't see a catapult set up across the creek, nor any other mechanism that could throw a 200-pound rock that high and that far. It made me think, though, about how far it could throw me. I am 175 pounds, so I know I could be thrown as far as the rock. And Bryant is only about 65 pounds. He'd land a mile away. It was eerie and weird, and I replay it in my mind frequently. The scariest thing to me was the lack of sound from the woods. What would make birds, squirrels, deer, frogs, and even the breeze stop? I'd love to hear your thoughts and the thoughts of your other listeners. I still have trouble coming to a conclusion about the events of that day. It's like I know what it was, but my mind won't accept it. Oh, and by the way, on our way out, we realized we'd strayed 30 minutes outside of the park's borders into the neighboring woods. Well, Gary, first let me say I'm really sorry that you and your wife lost your twin babies. That's heartbreaking. I've had some friends lose some kids, and man, there's no way for any of us who haven't to know how that feels, but all we can do is have some sort of non-experience empathy for you. It just must be horrible. I mean, good grief, I just lost a dog about a month ago, and it just kills me every day. But moving on, what a great dad you are, and mom, what great parents you are to take your kids on these trips and to organize that 5K run. What a great way to give back and use your pain to do something good with. But taking your kids on hikes, man, that's a great idea. These boys must be raring to go all the time. And I don't really know what to think about your experience. I mean, I cannot imagine anything that's natural in the woods that could throw a 200-pound rock as big as 2 truck tires off of a bank and into the middle of a creek and blow water up in the air and then throw rocks at you and things like that. Yeah, I would have got out too, but I think if it was me, I would have trouble accepting it too, but you just have to realize that these things are probably there and they don't like us in their habitat. They've been pushed out of so much habitat already, although we still have millions and millions and millions of acres for these things to live. I mean, if you travel across the United States, we haven't encroached that much, at least with urban development. Maybe with the farming and the agriculture, we've not really ruined, but we've transformed the land to suit us and to benefit us and to provide for us. And that does push them out. But, there are so many sightings and so many experiences like this that apparently the population is doing okay, because based on the encounters if you just took every story that I've done up to this date and you counted, and assuming every one of them is a separate entity or a separate being or Bigfoot, then we've got hundreds and hundreds of these things in the United States, and they're all over the place. They're in Canada, Alaska, the continental United States. Haven't heard anything from Hawaii yet, but even internationally, we've got stories from Europe and different places, the Philippines and Indonesia and different. Australia is a place where we get a lot of stories. And so, I'm kind of contradicting what I say. I don't know that the encroachment on their habitat is that big a deal, because there seems to be a lot of them around. But again, I'm just rambling, saying whatever comes to my mind. But Carrie, I really appreciate the story. And again, best wishes to your family. And I appreciate what you're doing. And let's move on to another story. Thanks, Carrie. Hey, we're between stories here. I want to let you know, yesterday I got an email from D.A. Roberts. If you're not familiar with D.A. Roberts, he's a writer. He's got 22 or 23 books out. He writes monster books. That's the best way to say it. You can look him up on Amazon or Facebook. And I think his email address is daroberts.com or daroberts.net. I'll put his website in the link below. But he's written some fan fiction with Steve Lilly, and I'm going to be putting that up in a podcast in the next week or so. I cannot wait. I haven't even downloaded it and read it yet, but I plan to tonight. So I want to let you guys know other people are writing some Steve Lilly stories, and DA's good enough to let me narrate it. So we're going to have another Steve Lilly edition by another writer. It should be awesome. So you guys stay tuned for that. I'll announce it a day or two before I put it up. Just want to let you know. Okay, here's an interesting one. The writer doesn't want to give his name, no problem. He actually named his wife several times through the story, and Neoma took it out, and I appreciate her doing that. This is what he writes. This is not my story, but my wife's. English is a second language for her, and I've decided to send you this story on her behalf. You have our permission to share it on the air should you choose. I've never had a Sasquatch encounter myself. For many, many reasons, I maintain full mental conviction that they most definitely exist within our world. My wife is Filipina and came to the United States from the Philippine Islands at the age of 26 in 1992. Her paternal grandfather was a provincial legal magistrate near Cebu. Oftentimes, he would be compensated for his legal services in the form of rural property. Over a career of 40 years, he became a very large landowner. When she was growing up, her parents, as well as most of her many aunts and uncles, were rural farmers, operating small to medium-sized farms on deeply rural, sparsely populated property. As a child, it was normal for my wife to visit her various aunts and uncles on these farms, sometimes just to visit and sometimes to help with some of the work. Once at the age of 10 in 1976, when visiting a favorite uncle who lived deep in the Philippine jungle, she had a Bigfoot encounter. It took place close to dusk between 7 and 8 p.m. Her uncle lived in a decent-sized, fairly nice home built out of a well-constructed Napa hut. One evening after dinner, she went out to the side porch to sit and relax in the cool evening air while he enjoyed a cigarette. My wife was sitting inside, but she got bored, so she went out to the porch to sit with him. As soon as she got outside, she noticed a foul odor similar to a skunk, but much worse. Being a loud-mouthed, obnoxious little kid, she harshly complained about the horrible smell. Her uncle sternly asked her to lower her voice and then pointed over to a tree about 50 yards away. High up in this tree, she saw an enormous, orangish-brown, hairy man sitting recumbent with his back against a tree and legs stretched out in front of him, resting on a limb. His legs were crossed at the knees, and he had enormously long feet sticking up in the air. This huge hairy man had a dry banana leaf rolled up tightly like a giant cigar and was sitting there calmly smoking it like a wise old man. The incredible size and length of his feet struck my wife as being hilariously funny, so she started jumping up and down and pointing at it while squealing loudly with laughter. Quickly, her uncle jumped up from his chair and lightly rapped her on the mouth with the back of his hand. While holding his index finger in front of his mouth, he said, "Shush, if you're going to make it mad, you're going to be sorry." She was furious with her uncle for treating her this way, and my wife stormed inside the house. Later, she would learn that her uncle saw the creature in the tree on a semi-regular basis. When my wife first came to the United States, she assumed that Americans knew Sasquatch were real. Over some time, once she figured out that Sasquatch were largely considered strictly mythical by most higher-minded Americans, she decided to share her story only with a select few individuals, usually after a beer or three. When asked to describe the creature the best way she could, my wife said it looked like a mixture between a human and an orangutan. It was 9 to 10 feet tall with orangish-brown hair similar in color to that of an orangutan, and it had grayish skin. Its feet looked to be 24 inches in length. She said it smoked the exact same way as a human would, taking deep drags and blowing the smoke out. On a side note, there's little doubt that these huge man-like creatures exist. By 2019, it seemed quite apparent that our government has gone to great lengths to not only conceal their existence, but to also create a societal subtext that people who believe in them must be crazy. Not only do we know that Sasquatch exists, but there are vast numbers of different breeds, sizes, and temperaments. The question we must ask ourselves, why does the government regularly go to such lengths to keep them out of our mainstream paradigm? It can only be a guess, but I assert part of the reason is that they don't want us to become further aware of some of the abilities which Sasquatch possess, such as infrasound and psychokinetic influence. They wouldn't want ordinary, lowly people to discover that maybe we might possess some hidden talents ourselves. Also, there's the further consideration that if Sasquatch cultures can strongly thrive in the wild for countless generations, in the complete absence of any centralized government or paper money, we can too. The government does not want us to figure out that we all might be able to live relatively free lives. I enjoy your program and appreciate all of your time and effort. Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate that. There's a story from the Philippines. Now, just playing devil's advocate here, this actually does sound like an orangutan. I mean, they're orange, they have gray skin. And sometimes, if y'all ever seen Any Which Way But Loose, I think that was a Clint Eastwood movie with the orangutan. I used to know his name, the orangutans. I think it's Bob. Maybe not. I don't know. They can mimic human behavior, and I think even in that movie, that orangutan smoked a cigarette. And maybe this was an orangutan. Are they even native to the Philippines? I don't know. I really don't know. But I do not dismiss the idea that this could be a form of Bigfoot living in the jungles of the Philippines. We've got stories from all over the world. Here's one from the Philippines of strange creatures. And I assume if orangutans do live in the Philippines, in the Philippine jungles, that people there know what they look like. So maybe her grandfather may have known this was an orangutan, and they're quite strong. They're very strong. They're like a gorilla. I mean, they look fat and lazy, but they're really agile, and they're made to live in the trees. They're built to do that. But so would Bigfoot be. So it could be either or. And none of that really matters because this was a great story. And this woman from the Philippines who's been here since 1992 is pretty sure she saw a Filipino Bigfoot. I mean, that's fascinating. Fascinating stuff. I really appreciate the writer sending it. Please tell your wife that we appreciate her sharing her story or allowing you to write it down and make a record of it. Appreciate it. Just as a short intermission here, here's 4 minutes of an interview I did with Will Jevning and Tom of the Creek Devil channel. Will Jevning is actually the name of his channel. You guys can look it up. I'll put a link to his channel below. I owe him a bunch of narrated stories, which I hope to get to him this week. But we did an interview and I've cut it up into segments and I'm dropping them in these videos. It's 4 minutes long. This is a 4-minute segment. Hope you guys enjoy it. Will knows this stuff. Let me ask a question here to Tom and Will. This is from Tanya on our YouTube page. I think this will be interesting to hear about. She says, my question would be, what are your thoughts on the national park disappearances as far as Bigfoot is concerned? Do you feel they could be responsible for some or all of them, or are they just unexplainable? And she goes on to say, do you feel there are certain areas where Bigfoot tend to be more violent and what areas they tend to be less violent?
Well, let's hit the first one on national parks. I know that's been sensationalized in some quarters. It's more than just national parks. It's not localized to those places. It's pretty much everywhere. People disappear all the time. There could be some who are attributed to the Sasquatch. Many are probably, much more mundane things. As far as aggressiveness isn't necessarily a regional thing. What I found over the years, and I've been involved in this almost 49 years, is it depends on the age and experience of a group. They're not all like that. Different groups and with age ranges have different levels of experience. And sometimes, a group may start going towards a more aggressive posture and become very aggressive. So it's just like people. I mean, you have different personalities and psychological mindsets and things like that. So it's kind of subjective to a particular group or even individuals.
Well, let me jump in real quick. On the aggression, you and I have talked about in the past the experiences, the encounters that people have had where the creatures come up, basically rush them, did a bluff charge, and then would just turn and walk away. So that would be an encounter that would be quite scary, but at the end of the day, you're still going home. On the other hand, there's the ones that we don't know about, where it wasn't a bluff charge, it was the real McCoy. And I don't know, can you comment on that a little bit, or?
Well, I would say in those cases, now a lot of people want to jump to conclusions with things. And I always say, take a little more measured approach. If it was done by a Sasquatch, where's the attendant evidence with that incident that supports that theory? And oftentimes I don't hear any of this. So it could be many, many other, like I said, more mundane reasons a person vanished.
You can sensationalize one thing and kind of point. You don't actually have to say it, but you can point people in that direction. And if someone is on a microphone and you hear their voice over some medium, it carries some authority, but that doesn't always mean that that's the way it's happening. So
very true.
So that's my opinion on that. I was going to ask, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say real quick what Tom mentioned about the bluff charges, and I've interviewed quite a few people that have had that happen to them, and it's what gorillas do. It's sort of it's a challenge, and the people were in shock and stood their ground, so they didn't move, and they told me that, I don't know why he didn't run, I must have been in shock, but they just stood there. So the creature would run up within 10 feet of them, stop, look at him for a bit, and then kind of get bored and walked away.
All right, here's an email from John, and I think this is Pacific Northwest. I'm reading this cold. I haven't read through this. Neoma sent it to me about 3 weeks ago, and I'm just going to read it, and we're all going to find out together what this story is about. And here's what he writes. Until August of 2020, I had really never paid attention to Bigfoot or necessarily bought into the fact that it's real. I've always liked the totem poles and the occasional tales and of course the jerky commercials. Although I was never a non-believer, I hadn't really given the subject much thought. That all changed last summer. I didn't have a sighting, but the event and circumstances are hard to make sense of without going down the Bigfoot path. I own 5 acres and a getaway cabin on the Skycomish River. I'm sure I pronounced that wrong. Skycomish River off Highway 2 just outside of Gold Bar, Washington. It is a beautiful parcel of peace and quiet that's about 45-minute drive from the sprawling suburbs of Seattle. Last summer, my girlfriend and I were relaxing by the campfire next to the riverbed just as dusk set in. We were watching the spawning salmon slap at the eddy on the other side of the river. It's a perfect holding point for the salmon, and steelhead, as a huge spawning flat, is the next thing waiting for them up the river from this pool. We were sitting there enjoying the evening when we heard a loud crack like a tree limb breaking about 100 yards downstream and across the river. We didn't pay much attention to it. Occasionally, a tree fall isn't that uncommon. Approximately 10 minutes later, we heard another limb or a small tree break. That was odd, but not especially concerning. Somewhere around 15 minutes after that, we heard a couple of heavy splashes in the eddy that were distinctly different sounding than the fish jumping. These were rocks. They were big ones. I've been a competitive fisherman and outdoorsman my whole life, and I know the difference between a fish jumping and slapping the water and a heavy rock splash. A big enough rock will hit the bottom of the riverbed, making a distinctive sound. And fish don't do that, and they live to tell about it. The sounds were intermittent and directly across the river from where we were sitting. We'd hear fish slap and then a heavy rock or two plunge in right on top of the school of salmon. Our gaze was now fixed on that spot. We were asking ourselves what the heck was going on. Suddenly, we saw a rock that was at least as big as a grapefruit, but probably more like a bowling ball, fly out of the trees and hit where the fish were jumping. We first thought, who would be over there heaving small boulders at salmon just before dark? And then it occurred to me to wonder how they would have gotten there. I could see half a mile up and down the river, and if anyone had crossed, I would have seen them. Even if I'd missed them, the terrain is next to impossible to stand in, let alone walk through for that distance. That side of the river is extremely steep, nor is there any reasonable access from behind. There's just miles and miles of mountains, evergreens, and undergrowth. As this continued, my curiosity got the better of me, so I walked out across the dry portion of the riverbed to see what was up. "You got your gun?" my girlfriend asked nervously. Well, of course I did. I'm never without it these days. It's about 100 yards to the edge of the riverbed from my property during the summer, and about another 20 yards across the river to where the rocks were flying. I got there and fixed my eyes on the spot where the rocks were being catapulted. Everything ceased. Even the birds went quiet. Total silence. There was only the sound of running water. Well, I stood there for a good 20 minutes or more. Nothing happened other than the occasional salmon jumping. I walked up and down the riverbank, changing my levels and vantage point to see if I could get a glimpse of what or who was doing this. I never saw anything. After 10 minutes or so, I turned and walked back to the campfire. My girlfriend and I were dumbfounded. We thought it was weird and somewhat freaky, but we couldn't figure out what had thrown the rocks. A few minutes later, it started again. The rocks weren't massive, but they weren't small baseball-sized rocks either. I estimated them to be the size of grapefruits and bowling balls, and they were being thrown with velocity. I started thinking, how could anybody be that strong? Earlier that year, I had been on the bank of the river with my 2 sons, they're 19 and 21, and we were throwing big rocks as sort of a macho man competition. None of us could heave rocks like that. My sons are 6'5" and 6'8", the latter being a 4A all-conference defensive end and a 4A all-conference offensive lineman with Division I offers. Yes, he played both sides of the ball and never took a play off. He's been referred to as a gorilla in a man suit. I tell you this because even he could not throw rocks as big as bowling balls. The rock throwing went on for a few more minutes and then it stopped. Just like that, it went back to nothing but salmon slapping the pool. I spoke with a couple of different people in the area about it, and someone suggested that it was a tweaker over there doing what tweakers do. That sounded plausible, so I just went with it, even though my instincts told me otherwise. Of the countless days and hours we've spent there over the last few years, we've seen only one questionable person on the riverbed. They were on our side and acting as if they might be high. To get to the other side, then maneuver to the spot where the incident occurred would take a superhuman feat. And then to get back in the dark, there's a slim chance of survival doing that. In the following days, it really began to sink in just how much strength would be required to do what we saw that night. That's when I began to think, could this be Bigfoot? Thus, my journey into research began. Several things jumped out at me while studying the subject. River/creek bed, salmon, dusk, tree breaks, and rocks thrown with velocity. These were all telltale signs of Bigfoot. I now realize how easily things can be rationalized and explained away, even when you know better. That sixth sense told me that it wasn't a tweaker. Even though I was first willing to accept that explanation, I know now that it wasn't. This was not Captain Tweaker America. So what could a Bigfoot have been doing trying to bonk salmon on the head with rocks? And how could he get them if he did? A short way downriver, it flattens and widens to an area of 30 yards wide and only about 2 feet deep. Could he have had help downstream waiting for the fish to float by? The current and terrain certainly lends itself to that. They are intelligent creatures, are they not? Finally, earlier in the summer, on 2 separate occasions, I had checked the trail cams I've set up around my property for security and captured a strange and very distinctive orb of light the size of a softball. These orbs could not have been lens flare because the sun was behind the camera at the time. I never gave it much thought until I discovered that it is an occurrence possibly related to Bigfoot. It may be nothing, or it may be something. Also, on one of the Bigfoot Facebook pages I belong to, someone from the town of Skykomish, which is several miles upriver from my property, posted pictures of possible footprints. When I asked them when the photos were taken, they answered last August. It was the exact same time of our incident. I have a theory on the tree breaks that we heard. Perhaps they are a warning to other predators that they are coming to a food source. It could make sense in that it would be beneficial to warn other predators such as bears that they're coming. Even though a black bear may be no match for a Bigfoot, in nature it is better to avoid any fight to risk injury. I look into the woods now with a different wonder than I had before. I know my story isn't exciting as many that you come across, but this is exactly what happened to me. Thank you for taking time to read it. Signed, John. Well, John, this story was very exciting, man. What are you kidding me? And you've really thought this through, and I would tend to agree with every conclusion you come to. I say on this channel a lot of times that I'm a skeptic and I question some of these things. I question just the whole theory of Bigfoot, but I believe Bigfoot exists. I really do. I don't know why. I don't know, unless you're like a total zealot for this topic. Some people think you're a non-believer and they kind of brush you off and, you know, don't you appreciate your audience? I don't know where people get all that stuff. I'm just reading the stories, lighten up. But I believe Bigfoot exists. I mean, we just had another story earlier in this podcast of huge rocks being thrown in a creek where a man and his sons were on a hike. Now, here's the same thing. The rocks are not as big. What's fascinating to me is that you put together he's throwing the rocks in the middle of a school of salmon, or where they're congregated in a pool while the water's low. And there's still a current, there's, the water's still moving, and could there be another one downstream collecting fish that he hit as they float down the stream? And that's a brilliant way to think about that. I would have never come up with that. But all in all, this was an awesome story. It's very exciting, and I love these stories, these anecdotal kind of evidence, especially when the writer does a lot of thinking and critical thinking and puts these things together. And now he walks into the woods with a wonder he had never had before. Did you guys hear that? And that's what the woods, being a part of this story reading project and learning about everybody's experiences, how I look at the woods in a different way now. I'm not afraid of them. I don't ever carry a weapon unless I'm hunting, which I don't really hunt much anymore, but I'm not really afraid of anything out there. I just have a great time in the woods, my dogs and I. And I don't live in the Pacific Northwest. I live in the southeastern United States, which is, we just don't have predators down here. But just cur dogs or coyotes don't get after you. There's just nothing here that will really, big predators. There's snakes and, I don't even think there's any spiders. I ride through spiders' nest every morning. I'm covered with spiders when I get back to the house. My wife has to brush them all off of me. And some of them will bite you. I mean, they bite, but they're not venomous. But there's really no big predators here. But I do when I go on rides, and we've been riding four-wheelers on different trails and stuff and going deep into the Holly Springs National Forest. And I look through the woods, and I'm like this man. I have a new sense of wonder after doing this for 3 years. And it's a good feeling. It makes me feel like a kid again, going through some of these woods and having those feelings. And so that's one benefit to doing this. It's kind of changed the way I look at things and made things a lot more fun for me when I'm away from this microphone. But there I go again, running my mouth. Let's end this. Listen, I really appreciate you guys listening to this video, and hopefully this week work will slow up a little bit and I can get a couple out. But I appreciate you listening, and we'll see you on the next podcast. Thank you.